This is Democracy Now! As we turn right now to the drivers gathered right here in New York City on Wall Street after the New York City strike began yesterday. This is Democracy Now! Producer Libby Rainey speaking with Inder Parmar, an Uber driver who went on strike.
My name is Inder Parmar. I've been driving for Uber since 2013, and my income has been dropped but drastically, because when I was working with Uber, it was $3 a mile, and I used to get $2.60 a mile. Today I get $1.15 a mile. And when I was driving in 2013-14, there was 40,000 drivers. Today is 160,000 drivers. My income has been drastically decreased from $37 an hour to about $10 an hour, and it's very hard to support my family and to myself. And I'm very lucky. I have 3 kids who supports me. They have very well jobs. They did master's degrees, and they are helping me out. Without that, I will have no way to survive.
You drive up to 80 hours a week, but you're treated as a part-time employee. How does that affect you? Okay.
In 2013-14, I was driving 70-80 hours. And I went to the office, and they said, all the Uber drivers are part-time drivers. I said, excuse me. I worked 80 hours last week, and you tell me I'm a part-time driver? He said, Uber policy is to have only part-time drivers, not a full-time driver. I said, then I'm worked 80 hours. You still call me a part-time driver? He said, yes, one of the managers over there. He said, all the drivers are part-time drivers. That's how Uber wants. They want every driver to be a part-time driver.
So your income has dropped from $37 an hour to around $9 an hour, and yet you have to pay for gas, you have to pay for car insurance. How much are you spending to be an Uber driver?
To work as an Uber driver, my expenses are average about $10 an hour. Okay, and when I make $10 an hour, I'm just meeting my expenses. I'm not taking any money to my house, to myself. To me, this IPO is an exploitation, and if anybody buys this IPO, they are becoming a member of an exploitation. And this is an exploitation of not one driver, 2 drivers, almost 3 million drivers. Like in 1900s, factories were exploiting the factory people, and that time all the political leaders woke up and they made the labor laws. And now the leaders have to wake up again to make a law for the drivers too, because 3 million drivers are suffering, and we need political help, and we need some political leaders to take a look into it, and the Labor Department to look into it, that Uber should not exploit drivers behind the door of that we are independent contractors.
You called this system, you called Uber, Lyft, these other apps, a slave system. Why?
I call Uber and Lyft as a slave system because, as I showed you, I'm getting paid $9, $10 an hour, where my expenses are $10 an hour. You know, literally I went home with a $0 to myself or to my family. That's why I call these companies exploitation and slave drivers.
Finally, you said without the help of your family, you would have been dead like some other drivers. There's been a spike in suicides by drivers here in New York City. Can you talk about that and the devastation that this leads to people's lives?
Okay, I'll tell. Most of these drivers were yellow cab drivers. They took $1 million loan on their medallions, and they could not make the payments, and the banks were foreclosing on their houses and on their accounts. All those things were getting frozen, and they could not take that thing. If you see, 2 years ago, taxi newspapers had no advertisement for suicide help. Today, every taxi newspaper have half a page of ad telling the drivers not to commit suicide. Come to them for help. We don't need help to commit suicide. We need help to make money. What we were making 2 years ago, we want to make same amount of money. This way we are financially and physically and mentally healthy. But today, Uber and Lyft had made a situation we are mentally, physically and financially. All 3 ways we are getting exploited. We will buy these multi-billion-dollar companies, and we do not have any help from nobody. We do not need a doctor to tell us not to go commit suicide, and we do not need to take a medication for depression. We need to get paid properly what we do. We were getting paid properly in 2013, 14, 15. 17, 18, 19, our income has been dropped by 2/3. And that's why so many drivers are in depression, so many drivers are committing suicide all over the country. We need our political leaders and Labor Department to wake up.
That was striking Uber driver Inder Parmar speaking to Democracy Now!'s Libby Rainey. Special thanks to Teja Studio and Tyler Sloan. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. We're joined in studio by Bhairavi Desai, who is the executive director and co-founder of the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, which represents over 21,000 taxi drivers in New York City. She was out there yesterday. Talk about the significance of this global strike that took place as Uber is just about to go public.
It was absolutely amazing. There were strikes across every single continent. The United States, there were several cities, and it was just a rolling strike for over a 24-hour period. It's the first time that we've ever seen this among drivers.
And why was it scheduled just as Uber is about to go public?
Well, it was timed with the IPO. In its pre-IPO filing called, the S-1 to the Securities and Exchange Commission, Uber unabashedly notes in there that they expect driver dissatisfaction to only increase. They expect to cut driver pay, to cut incentives, and move quickly into driverless vehicles. And this is all after also acknowledging that the vast majority of drivers earn below minimum wage.
So you're saying Uber expects to cut driver wages more, but as we've just heard, there's already been a massive and precipitous decline in drivers' income for Uber. Now, why has that decline happened?
Well, the business model is so fundamentally anti-worker. Uber saturated the streets with vehicles, and then they continued to cut the rate of fare that the drivers would be paid by. And so, as Inder was saying, you're competing with so many more people, and you're getting paid less per fare. On top of that, you're paying heavy costs for vehicles to rent or to buy in order to go to work with them.
So you're head of the New York Taxi Workers Alliance. Explain, as we just heard, the rideshare driver talking about the effect on taxi workers.
Well, in New York City, out of our 21,000 members, about 10,000 of them actually drive for Uber or Lyft. We started out as a yellow cab drivers organization back in '98, but over the past 5 years, as more of our members started to drive for Uber and Lyft, they retained the membership, and there's one of our members. We have a unity platform because, as he said, this is fundamentally about the race to the bottom. Uber starves the Uber driver so they can starve the taxi driver. So both groups of drivers need to stand together against this business model.
So were there yellow taxi cab drivers who moved entirely to Uber, and if so, why?
It's been a revolving door of desperation because in the beginning, Uber offered bonuses and promotions, $60,000 guaranteed. Federal Trade Commission investigation actually found that only 10% of the drivers ever grossed what Uber had actually promised. Uber ended up settling for a $20 million fine because of false advertising.
Talk more about this issue of independent contractors, part-time workers versus full-time workers.
Well, the gig economy, whether it's Uber, Lyft, or Handy or TaskRabbit, anytime workers have demanded, a decent pay, livable incomes and job security, dignified work, they've responded by saying, well, this isn't supposed to be full-time. This is part-time. Uber's gone as far as to say, by part-time, we mean just a couple of hours here and there each week. Every time we raise the bar to just get to the floor of basic employment protections, they lower the expectation of what this is actually supposed to be. When they lobby, they call it a job. Once they get the drivers in, they call it a gig.
And what do you think people who use Uber and Lyft, New York is one of the biggest markets for Uber, what should people know?
Well, both New York and London, have had massive driver opposition. And what people should know is that this is a fundamentally flawed business model. The gig economy represents less than 1% of the U.S. economy, yet they are lobbying for explicit exemption from not only taxi laws, but also labor laws. They're looking to overturn basic protections. Today, taxi drivers, Uber drivers are on that front line. lines. But there's millions of workers standing behind us if we fall. 40 years ago, taxi drivers were considered commission employees. They then became independent contractors, being stripped of all basic labor protections, from minimum wage to the right to democratic unionism and collective bargaining. From drivers, it went on to more than 30% of the American workforce. We've been in this place again. But the significance of May 8th was that it was the drivers from Uber themselves. Uber is partly seeking a $90 billion valuation, both so its founders can cash out, but also so it can become too big to fail as it unveils this dystopian, business model against workers and communities. What we're saying is they have made drivers too poor to live. And these two forces are now on a collision course. We wanted to send a message yesterday. We're not deterred by Wall Street and their wealth. We know this business model cannot exist without the drivers. In their S1 filing, they repeated that they need to go into driverless cars. They can't get drivers out of the car fast enough. And what we're saying is, but we exist now, and you need to answer to that.
Explain how tips work, because when you go into one of these cars, you don't pay at the end. The driver showed Democracy Now! Yesterday, the person who was just interviewed, his pay stubs, and for 20 hours work, he had $2 worth of tips.
So when these companies started, they touted the fact that, no tip is necessary. It's one of the ways we're cheaper than a taxi. Once tipping started, it's turned out that only about 2% of passengers tip. They fundamentally changed that culture. It's another way that they brought down driver incomes.
We want to thank you very much for joining us. Bhairavi Desai is Executive Director and co-founder of the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, representing over 21,000 taxi drivers in New York City. And, of course, we'll continue to follow this struggle. That includes not only the Uber and Lyft drivers, but also yellow cab drivers as well. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, up to 1 million species extinct in our lifetimes. Stay with us.